lecture that is jointly sponsored by the Georgia Tech Honors Program, of which I am director. My name is Greg Noble, and co-sponsored by the College of Sciences with my colleague Paul Houston, the dean, who will speak in a moment. It's been a very good partnership for the last 5 years, and we're looking forward to continuing. In the interest of partnership, intellectual partnership, I'll ask all of you, if you would, please to silence these devices. You may put them in the vibrate position, or better yet, just turn them off. There's a radical step. Live without them for an hour. I always like to begin by saying a word about the man for whom this lectureship is named, Les Karlovitz. Les Karlovitz was the dean of the College of Sciences and Liberal Studies back in the 1980s. Les was a mathematician, but a man of very wide-ranging intellect and interest. And one of the things Les Karlovitz liked to do as dean of the College of Science and Liberal Studies, COSAL as we call it, was to bring people together, was to bring people from different disciplines together. He was a very interdisciplinary dean, and we would have meetings frequently where chemists would talk to a broad audience, including historians like myself, and occasionally historians or literature professors would talk to their colleagues in math and biology and chemistry and so forth. And I think that the interdisciplinary nature of this lecture series really is, and partly in tribute to, and frankly, in memory of Les Karlovitz, who died about 20 years ago. Les was a great fan of what I like to call accessible science, helping people who are not in the scientific community understand and appreciate the benefit and the beauty of the discipline in science. And I think we'll see an exercise in that today. Well, events like this don't just happen, and I have a few thank yous I want to say in acknowledgement of how this event came together. I especially want to thank my colleagues in the Honors Program Office, Carrie White and Nicole Leonard, who are way back in the back. There they are. My other Honors Program colleague, Monica Hawka, who really is, I have to say, and she'll say it before I do, the driving force behind this event. Monica is the one who gets things done, and I very much appreciate her for it. I also want to thank especially Mike Jasper, who's back in the back. Mike has done virtually everything of the instrumental side for this presentation, from making the poster that you've all seen outside, to helping with getting the slides done today, and now doing this, filming it, and so forth. I sometimes have to remember that Mike is just a second-year student in mechanical engineering. I tend to think of him as an associate professor. He's got a ways to go. I also want to thank my colleague and frequent Honors Program Professor Hugh Crawford, whose cabin, if you came in the building, you've seen, it's a, if not a replica of, an homage to Bernd Heinrich's own cabin up in Maine. Hugh built it last semester with his students, and happily some of his students, in another form of homage, have created the first edition, Volume 1, Issue 1 of Young Naturalist, Georgia Tech Young Naturalist. And this one is the special Bernd Heinrich edition. And so we'll be seeing that. I do want to say, by the way, that the cabin you see up there will soon find a home, I think a better home, frankly, at the Atlanta Day Shelter for Women and Children, where it will be donated as a playscape, a play place for the children there. And I'm now told that the children get a lot of copies of this. And that's great. That's wonderful. I think this is just a perfect ending, or a perfect repurposing of that cabin. Finally, I want to thank, again, my colleague Paul Houston, the Dean of the College of Sciences. I think I can call him both a colleague and a friend, someone I very much enjoy working with, not just on this event, but on other activities on campus. And in that spirit of gratitude, I want to turn the floor over to Paul Houston, who will introduce our speaker, Bernd Heinrich.
Thank you very much, Rick. Good evening. On behalf of the College of Sciences, I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this lecture, and I'm honored to introduce the speaker. Our speaker today has led a very interesting life. He was born in 1940 in Germany. He came with his family in 1951 to Maine, where he subsequently attended the University of Maine as an undergraduate, and then went on to UCLA as a graduate student and earned there his PhD. Following that, he was a professor of entomology at the University of California, Berkeley for many years. And in 1980, he moved to the University of Vermont, where he's a professor of zoology and biology. He's an avid runner. In 1979, he won the Golden Gate Marathon. And he also still holds the All-American record for a race that is just a short one, 100 miles. He's the author of a book, Why We Run, which is a natural history, and it's for sale along with one of his other books in the back at the end of the lecture. Dr. Heinrich spends much of the year in a primitive cabin, maybe not quite so primitive as the one outside, but he built it himself in western Maine, and he spends a lot of time there observing, and he writes about what he observes. He evidently observes a lot because he's written 18 books. Many of them are illustrated with his own pictures and his own watercolors. His most recent one is called The Nesting Season, Cuckoos, Cuckolds, and the Invention of Monogamy. Perhaps he'll tell us something about that this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bernd Heinrich to present the 2012 Carlowitz Lecture.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Georgia Tech, and it's a great honor to be invited. And so I expect there's going to be a lot of technici in the audience, and maybe some of them might suspect that I'm a biologist. So I thank you very much for coming. And because, you know, I don't know how many biologists go to technology seminars. So obviously I had to ponder, you know, what I was going to talk about, and but I just decided eventually that I actually am kind of a techie anyway myself, because and maybe there isn't that much difference between a techie and a biologist, and I think it's. So let me try to explain. I mean, in biology, we try to find mechanisms in nature that exist, and these mechanisms solve particular problems that organisms have encountered in nature, and they were, you know, created actually mindlessly. That's the difference between technology. These were created mindlessly over millions of years of evolution, and they were perfected under the most demanding conditions and tested under life and death conditions. Now, technology, I think technology is more the invention and the making of mechanisms that solve ever new problems and contemporary problems, and maybe even future problems. So it's also related to problem solving and finding ways to do it, and understanding the background is and how the mechanisms work is really, you know, what's at stake, and that's very similar. Try to understand how mechanisms work. And so I've always been interested in all kinds of mechanisms, how things get done by different organisms, solving their particular problems. Yeah, I think I've had great good fortune to find, and you know, by being up there in the woods and all around, to examine and study an amazing variety of different designs in nature. And it's always been really challenging. It's always been a lot of fun, and it's always been an adventure. So when Monica Halka asked me to about giving a talk, I came up with the title birds and bees, basically because I had worked with bees. Since I was a kid, I was holding bees, had beehives. They worked with bumblebees, as you'll see, and worked in the last few years with ravens a lot. But now that you're all here, maybe I can change it to the moths and the bees, moths and the birds, because I worked a lot with moths too. In fact, that's where I really started doing techie type work, figuring out mechanisms. In any case, rather than bearing down and examining any one specific mechanism in detail with all the proofs and statistics and so on, so I decided instead to stand back and take you kind of on a tour and show you basically how one thing led to another. How projects are connected and one can lead to another. I think you'll agree that sometimes the turns that one takes can turn out to be some of the most provocative ways to go, and a lot of times also the most productive. But we'll see. I'll try to show the different connections from one to the other. So in most of us, the trajectory starts kind of early, and I think mainly the thing is perhaps not always to keep going in the same direction, but to always keep going. And I've done that, but maybe much better is to keep going in a direction and also be changing once in a while. So I'll let you decide that. In any case, I kind of grew up in the woods, really, and then on a farm. And from early on, I was collecting beetles and interested in birds and moths. And as I said, I kept bees. And in particular, I collected Sphinx moths, kind of a hobby, because these are big moths that look a little bit like hummingbirds when they fly. In fact, the first ones I ever saw, I actually thought it was a little tiny hummingbird. I caught it in a net and looked at it and found out it had antennae. And so that was made an insect rather than a bird. So I collected them on milkweed in the back of the barn, and in the evening when they would be out there flying. And then I also hunted for caterpillars and raised them. So in this way, I got a lot of contact with the biology of these things. And when I went to UCLA, after I had got my master's degree at the University of Maine, and actually there had worked on acetate and glucose, the oxidative metabolism of glucose and acetate. So that was really kind of biochemistry. So that was actually the reason I kind of ended up at UCLA, because they had some people there who were tops in the metabolism field, and so I got to go in there, got to go there. But after a year there, I went back to the moths, and back to the caterpillars, and back to the birds. But especially with respect to the Sphinx moths, because at that time there was a paper that came out in Nature that talked about temperature regulation in the Sphinx moth in flight. So this was a Sphinx moth that people had taken their temperatures and found that it maintained the same temperature. I think it was around 43 degrees centigrade, which is higher, quite a bit higher than our own body temperature, regardless of the air temperature. Now you know when when it gets colder, to maintain the high temperature, you burn more fuel, and that's how you keep warmer. So that was the hypothesis that they had. And But there seemed something wrong with it to me because the insect was supposed to be flying. And how in the heck, what kind of a mechanism could you have where you are flying and producing more heat at one time rather than another time? Were there more wing beats or harder contractions or what? So I was interested in that, and it all basically relates to muscle physiology. So I was interested in running. I ran cross country. So as you know, athletes have to warm up, increase their body temperature actually a little bit, and before competing to get the most out of the muscles. So a higher body temperature is often better for more vigorous output. So this is one of the reasons, of course, that these moths now had a very high body temperature, higher than ours, and they would contract their muscles about 60 hertz. So they are very fast muscle contraction, and they can only do that when they're very hot. So anyway, this is where I started, and I think at this point we can start with the slides. And as I said, I will try to move fairly fast and not get to all the details of the test because that will take too long. Let's see if I have to run over here and get a gasser here. I think they're supposed to advance.
It's
No?
on the
Huh?
There's two arrows. The one on the right.
Oh, the one to the right is forward. Okay. Okay, first of all, most insects are small, and most of them rely on solar energy to heat. So solar panels, were invented long before they were invented by humans. And here's a butterfly, and dark pigmentation helps to absorb solar radiation. So many butterflies, they orient their solar panels to the sun in such a way that they get the maximum, and they will vary the angles of the wings, orient to the sun, and at the same time orient in such a way on a warm substrate so that convection is minimized. So their behavior is geared to picking up solar radiation. But of course, when they're doing this, they can't do much else. They're grounded. They can't be active. Now, can we douse some of the near lights maybe a little bit? Or I don't know, it looks awfully blurry. But in part, this is blurry. So what we have here is the Sphinx moth. And this Sphinx moth is sitting still. This moth flies at night and doesn't have solar radiation to warm up. And so it vibrates its wings. And this is because it contracts the muscles that move the wings. The upstroke and the downstroke muscles are activated almost at the same time so that it shivers and vibrates. So it's producing heat. And this is a moth in flight now. And it has a long tongue going, yeah, this is much better, thank you very much. Going to a flower here, this is the tongue. And so when it flies, it looks a lot like a hummingbird. That's too dark. but it flies in the dark like that, that's okay. Let me go back. Okay, so I wanted to find out what happens during flight. And quite a few experiments were done, but in order to find out where it might be most productive to look for hints of what the mechanism might be, first of all, look at the anatomy. What does the anatomy tell me? What is the architecture of the thing? And here's the sagittal section of a moth, and here you see the abdomen. It's basically hollow air sacs, and here is the thorax, and this is muscle here that move the wings. There's a set of upstroke and a set of downstroke muscles, but when you look at the circulatory system, this is the heart. It pumps blood anteriorly, and it goes like this. This goes to the wings here, and then it makes this loop. And I said, when I saw that loop, I said, that looks like a, see, this abdomen stays cool, and this stays hot. actually, I should tell you the way the body temperatures were measured. Call it the grab and stab technique. The moth flies and you grab it and stick a thermocouple in, and a small thermocouple that's not going to pick up too much of the heat, so it isn't going to bury. And you have to do it quick enough so that you don't get the cooling in your fingers. So it's a quick grab and stab. But others had put it on a wire and let it hung and flutter. And what happens then, the moth doesn't really fly very much, and it gets very lazy. And if it's held up, you know, it doesn't put out all the energy expenditure. And all the experiments turned out to be wrong because it wasn't really flying. So one of the biggest problems was to get these things to fly in a temperature-controlled room, and then catch them, grab and stab and get a temperature. And if you do that, the abdominal temperature is always pretty close to, not always, but it tends to be close to air temperature. And this stays the same regardless of the air temperature. So indeed it did. Okay, so I was wondering if maybe they were just stabilizing thoracic temperature, not by producing more heat, because the wing beat frequency was the same. And then when I measured the oxygen consumption of the guys in flight, it was the same regardless of air temperature, even though the difference between air and body temperature varied like about four times. The heat loss should have been 4 times different. So then I said, well, maybe they're regulating heat loss rather than heat production. So this could be a cooling. And if so, then this cold blood should be going through the thorax and removing the heat. It goes to the head and then it percolates back. It's only a one-way vessel, then it percolates back and go back into the abdomen. So this blood coming from here should be heated, goes to the head, and then percolates back through here. So it should be warm here and get cooler and cooler and cooler, and then go in. There are holes here where the blood goes in and recirculate it back. And then if you keep this circulating long enough, it should be like a heat radiator. The abdomen should be like a heat radiator picking up the heat. So then I did heart surgery on the insect. When you remove the scales on the dorsum of the abdomen, you see the heart revealed here. And I took a little surgeon's needle and went through here and tied it off with a tiny piece of thread. And then let the moth fly. Now, if we do heart surgery where we tie off our aorta, we'd be dead in a second, right? But not with a moth, because we'd be dead because we'd go brain dead because we need the oxygen supply. But the moth gets the oxygen supply through ports on the side of the abdomen, and it's pumped in through pipes, basically, to the muscles and back. So it doesn't require the blood for oxygen transport or for CO2, getting rid of CO2. So it doesn't need it. So you take the heart out and the moth can still fly just like always. It will eventually run out of fuel because it doesn't get the fuel that have to be transported from the abdomen eventually. Okay, so the experiment with the moth, so now I'll show you the results. Remember here is air temperature, and here thoracic temperature, and this line represents the normal from the grab and stab. In other words, if I got the moth at 12 degrees centigrade, they had a thoracic temperature of 26 degrees above ambient. If I caught them at 32, they were like 44 or something like that. So the excess here is 36 here. So, you know, they're about 8 degrees above. So huge difference. So they're not exactly stable, but they're fairly well regulated. Now, these dots here represent moths that were, each is a separate moth that was flown for 4 minutes, enough time that it would stabilize its temperature, grab and stab. And in this range, that they were exactly the same temperature, but note that this here is fairly parallel with ambient. But then when it gets above this temperature, then they exceed up to 46, and the moth would flutter to the ground and it would overheat. And beyond this, they couldn't fly anymore because they were overheating. They were really frying. And if I took the fur off, took off their fur coat, you know, the covering of scales that looked like fur, then they could fly again. And these were depilated moths. And again, they didn't regulate. They kept a constant temperature except, although it was less because they didn't have a fur coat on. So here was kind of proof that they were regulating by regulating heat loss. This is actually a photograph I took of a moth that, that I still keep as a kind of a trophy, because this was sort of the gravy on the pie that first showed me another definitive experiment. What you see here are little wires hanging out, and I tied them all together. These are thermocouple wires, and wires used also to get signals from the heart to look at heart activity. And this was a moth that was pinned down. And so instead of producing the heat by flight, by the output of the metabolism, I put a heat lamp on it. So I was putting in a heat put, external heat put, and then seeing what the moth would do with it. In other words, was this reaction really a reaction to heat as such? And so here are the results. Here's the moth pinned down, heat put onto the thorax, and thermocouples here in the thorax, and in the heart at 2 places, and here. So in other words, if the heart circulates, the blood would come out here, and here, or here back. So what you find is, as you put the heat on, a constant amount of heat, here is the thorax heating up, and the abdomen starts to heat up eventually, but first here, and then here. If you watch the heart, here the blood trickles, and here it shoots. So that's why the temperatures are the same, because it's shooting it here very quickly. And if you look at the heart recordings, the mechanical activity actually, you find that when the thoracic temperature is low, that there's little activity, but when it's really starting to heat over 40 degrees, over 44 degrees, then it's very, very rapid and very, so the heart activity is related to the heat input, and that is related to the amount of heat that's transferred from the thorax to the abdomen. In other words, here, only the thorax is being heated, but the abdomen is heating up. So it's dumping heat. So, okay, so that was kind of what really got me started, because it was kind of a discovery. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. An insect would regulate its body temperature by its physiology. So here was a riddle of how it could solve this problem. And this problem was that here was a big animal producing a lot of heat, and it had to keep on flying even at high temperatures, because mostly a tropical animal, and it could do that, have this high metabolism, heat production, and exercise very heavily at high temperatures, and do this heavy work like hovering in front of flowers. Now, another animal that does it also, dragonflies. This is the green darner. This is not a very good picture of one, because it should have been actually when flying. You see them in the summertime flying fairly high, usually back and forth, hawking insects. And they fly continuously, more or less, until they arrest. Of course, when they arrest, body temperature very quickly approaches air temperature. But anyway, they are insulated actually too in the thorax by air sacs. They don't have fur, but they have air sacs. You look at this. So anyways, when they have a long abdomen, so they are quite big, green darner. And so here I show you a picture of the abdomen. Actually, also you see a little bit of wax here. I had waxed the abdomen, so the abdomen, it breathes by the abdomen moving. and you can stop the breathing movements by sticking it together with wax. And it turned out it could still regulate its temperature if you put in heat like you did with the moth. Even though it couldn't breathe, it could still regulate its temperature. However, if you took the heart, here's the thorax, and here I pulled it up with a pin here. This is an insect pin, and here the blood is coming this way. And I made a hole here, and here you see the blood occluded there by the pin. And here there's no blood going further to the thorax. So remember with the moth, the blood goes in the bottom, it comes and goes this way. Now if you stop it, it couldn't cool the thorax anymore. So the dragonfly does the same thing, and other dragonflies who are sit and wait predators that sit in one place, and then hawk flies fly back to the perch. They don't ever have that problem of heating up, except when they're in the sunshine too long, and they can get rid of heat by sticking the abdomen up in the air. They call the obelisk position, and reducing the amount of heat input to the body from the sun. And actually, this was one of the ideas which I used in the book Why We Run, about human evolution, because we are upright and became predators on the plains and could reduce our heat input a great deal relative to many other animals who had a much bigger surface area. We were hunters in the daytime, in the midday sun, when the others had to go in the shade, and in part is because we're upright, and especially if we have a bunch of hair on the head, we shield ourselves from the heat input. And so here we see sort of insect analogs. Okay, now I want to tell you about another kind of moth. Since these insects in the heat had the problem of overheating, there are others who potentially have the problem of being too cold. And these are winter woods in Maine, and actually on days when it gets above or just near the freezing point of water, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you find moths out. And here you see one of these winter moths. It's called the family is called the Noctuidae. It's a much smaller moth. Here's on the beach flood. You notice it's basically still winter, nothing has opened yet. But they're out there, and they're feeding on the sap that runs from twigs mostly, where squirrels have fed. And I wanted to find what they did. They're kind of chunky and have rapid wing beats, and should produce a lot of heat. So, but they also have a lot of insulation. This is the thorax, and here's the abdomen. So this, of course, is where the heat is produced. And you would think that they would want to retain as much heat as possible. And here's actually a close-up of the hair. And this was one of my science articles on the regulation temperature of these moths. So, so that's why you see actually this looked like fur, and they put it on the cover. Here are some thermograph pictures of these moths. And let's see, I think I have it turned around, but that's all right. This is the first picture. Here's the thorax, here are the wings, and this is the second picture. The heat is increasing, here's more heat, and then the red is even more heat. Here again there's a moth, and now the yellow is more heat. And but what I wanted to show is this is the thorax, and the abdomen would be here, but the abdomen stays absolutely cold. As you would expect if they were trying to retain as much heat as possible in the thorax, so as to retain as much heat and not lose it. So the question was, how can they do that? Again, let's take a look at the anatomy. Well, actually, I have a picture of the body temperature, which is even better from now. So anyway, these are grab and stab pictures, and these guys are not up into the 40s. They're a little bit cooler, not quite so hot like the Sphinx moth, but they're pretty darn warm, almost close as ours. Down to temperatures about, a little above 5 degrees centigrade, so that they're really heated up quite a bit. But the abdominal temperature is almost the same as this line with air temperature. So they're almost indistinguishable from air temperature. They're keeping the abdomen really, really cold. And they're definitely not dumping any heat into the abdomen because the difference is even smaller up here. So if they were keeping this difference from ambient to thorax, this high here and this smaller here, if they were keeping it down instead of having it parallel and dumping heat in, then this line should be going up like this, but it's going the opposite direction. So what's happening? So here is now the anatomy of one of these moths, a very diagrammatic anatomy. But notice now that this, in the thorax, the plumbing looks a lot different. And so here's my representation of it. First of all, there are a bunch of air sacs between the thorax where heat is produced. And here there are digestive organs and so on, reproductive, but there isn't any significant heat being produced. But this is kept separate by a bunch of air sacs, which would insulate. The air sacs are the best insulation. And if you look at the heart, it makes this loop right here. And so all the blood that comes from the thorax that's pumped in here has to come through this little channel here, which is exactly the same channel where this cold blood comes in. So when this warm blood goes this way and the cold blood goes this way, this is what they call the countercurrent heat exchange area. And so the cold blood would be picking up the heat that's coming in and returning it. So there should be heat being returned, being recovered by this countercurrent. And it looks like here, instead of a cooling loop, there's another countercurrent heat exchanger here, which presumably would reduce the heat loss to the thorax. So here, looking at the anatomy, you get hints of the mechanism of how this works. And here's just a comparison again of the Sphinx moth and the smaller geometric winter moth, and this is a more tropical one. Okay, now another thing comes in here now, and this is size. Here we're looking at different moth species and looking at size. So this here is about sparrow size. Some of these big Sphinx moths, they're as big as a bird, sparrow, small sparrow. And these were moths that came to a light and just grabbed them, took their temperatures. We knew they were in flight because they were coming to the light, and then could grab them quickly, stab them, and whoops. Note there's a very steep curve. The smaller they are, the lower the temperature. Now here is now a very small moth that flies in New England in the wintertime. It only weighs a few milligrams, and they almost they flutter in the fall and in the winter. And here we have, this is a male, and this is a female. And remember the flight. So here we see total different architecture that's again related to temperature. If you're very, very small, you can't generate any heat at all, really. That stays in. And so the flight effort, the flight expenditure, energy expenditure of the muscles is much lower. So what this moth does, it has very large wings, the males, and it actually kind of almost like sails. It flutters and if there's a slight breeze, it can be carried along. So it's a very weak flyer, but it can't carry very much weight. If it carried a little bit more weight, it couldn't flutter at all, it would just drop to the ground. And the thing is, the female is full of eggs, and she is very heavy, and if she had the wings, she wouldn't even be able to fly. There are some moths where the females have vestigial wings, and here, these have lost them entirely, the females. Simply because, not simply, but one of the reasons is that if they did have wings, they still couldn't get enough power because they couldn't get warm enough. So, yeah, this tiny one can kind of flutter the males and go along, and their body temperature is very close to air temperature, and they can fly almost at 0 degrees, almost near the freezing point. So the interesting thing is that they can flutter along with a muscle temperature close to freezing, which the other moths that we looked at that warm up cannot do. If they had temperature like that, they couldn't move at all. So this indicates that the muscle temperature that these animals have is the physiologies adapt to the muscle temperature that can be generated during flight. And if you're really big, you necessarily are going to generate a lot of high temperature. But if let's say, if you're automatically going to generate a lot of heat, and if you were ready for to take off at a high at the ambient temperature and couldn't what am I trying to say? It's easier to lose heat and maintain the temperature than if you immediately started to overheat and would have to stop. In other words, if our body temperature was normal at, let's say, was not above ambient, if it was, let's say, like 65 degrees Fahrenheit, then as soon as we walk, we overheat, and we'd have to stop. So it's better for us to regulate a temperature that's much higher, because then we get a lot of activity and we can do a lot of running around. We might even stabilize it with very little regulation if it's high enough. But if it's too low, boom, we're immediately in a problem. We have to lose, we have the problem of getting rid of heat, or we have to stop activity. So the bigger ones can readily get rid of heat, more readily get rid of heat than and can keep going. Okay, but the muscles can be adapted to operate at very low temperatures. Okay, now I just want to switch to honeybees as opposed to these moths. And one thing they do is they land on flowers and they suck up nectar and fill up their honey crop. And here's a diagrammatic representation showing a honeybee. And here's a honey crop. And they make the honey by regurgitating and then wagging it in the tongue here, providing surface area, and there's evaporation occurring. And this way, the nectar is made into honey, in part by the bee and in part in the hive itself. Now, when you look at the temperatures of these guys, you find, again, that the abdomen never heats up. Even if you put lots of heat onto the thorax, the abdomen doesn't heat up. And I think, again, here's a counter-current heat exchanger. Here's a coil, so that blood that goes this way encounters all of the surface area and is recovered and does not leak into the abdomen. You can't get the abdomen to heat up. And the honeybees have this interesting mechanism. One of the few insects that can do it is that they use this honey production mechanism also as a temperature regulation. So if they're overheated, they regurgitate fluid and from the tongue, and this cools the head and then withdraws heat from the thorax. And here is a thermal picture of the honeybee. He has a head, the thorax, and the abdomen, which doesn't heat up. And this is analogous to humans. He has Jack Foltz winning the Boston Marathon that year, I forgot, 1967 or something. And I don't know if he was the only one that was using a spray bottle, but he had the right idea and kept going because he could keep his temperature down. So anyway, so with bees, I was also interested in the swarms. They have a different problem, and you have big crowding inside. And I wanted. There was a paper out that proposed the outside bees tend to maintain the minimum temperature that's just okay. If you knock this swarm down, beekeepers will shake the branch, put a box down there, and they all drop in. And that's because when they're resting here, they save energy and let the temperature drop. However, the inside bees, in the middle, tend to be hot. And there is a theory that they were producing heat in order to heat the outside bees. And I didn't believe it. So I was grabbing some swarms. This is when I was at Berkeley. And here I'm getting a swarm. And I brought them in the lab. And would shake the bees down in a container and have kind of a sock here. And they would all crawl up in here and around it. And then the bees inside couldn't get to the outside. If there were bees traveling from the inside telling the message, okay guys, you've got to produce more heat, we're cold out here. So I was preventing them from doing that by having them inside the sock. You can just barely see some of the gauze here, the green gauze. So anyway, it turned out that they didn't. The temperature regulation was exactly the same. I could take the temperatures, and here's another swarm in the lab where the thermocouple, actually I had the swarm built underneath this cover, and the little holes, I could stick in thermocouples wherever I wanted, so I could find out temperature wherever I wanted inside the swarm. And I could also put a microphone inside. After a while, the swarm will produce comb and actually hang there. So this was actually from inside the swarm, but just to show the microphone that was inside. And so another hypothesis was that the bees were crying on the outside, it's cold out here, you guys inside produce more heat. And so, you know, I would eavesdrop what they were saying on the outside, broadcast it on the inside, and anytime I wanted to see if they were lying and see what happens, see the temperature change. But nothing ever happened. I should say, but basically what happened is the punchline is that as it gets colder, the bees on the outside of the swarm crowd ever deeper into the swarm to get warmer. And as they're doing that, they're plugging all the holes. And as they're plugging all the holes, then the resting metabolism of the bees inside increases because they're getting hotter, and the resting metabolism goes up, so they're producing more heat. So it's a byproduct of the outside bees controlling what the inside bees are subjected to. And if the inside bees get too hot, then they crawl out, and so that they regulate the high point. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to, how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes.
Anyway, bumblebees. Okay, here's, let's bring it in the lab. Basically, the bumblebees also regulate their temperature, but they sit on the flowers, and they're not continuous flyers. So it turned out they must be producing heat while they're sitting still. But you never see them wiggling their wings like moths do. And it turns out that they have a kind of a clutch mechanism. They can lock their wings in so that they can exercise their flight muscles without moving their wings. And so we had to this is with a colleague and Kemmer. I wasn't up on the technology of electrophysiology, so I went with, whoops, excuse me, I'm going the wrong ways. Okay, so here is this bee on this little wheel, and it's running around. It can keep running, and it's staying in place. But we can have electrodes in the thorax and eavesdrop what's going on. So, for example, here we had electrical recordings from the different muscles in the thorax, the wing depressors and the wing elevators, in the thoracic temperature, the air temperature, and seeing what activity of the muscles did to the temperature of the thorax. And this is just a picture of the upstroke and downstroke muscles. They actually don't directly work on the wings, they work indirectly by compressing the thorax and relaxing it. So it's like a indirect, that's why they call them indirect muscles. And if you look at the activity of the muscles, if they're at low temperature, the spikes are far apart, and if they're at high temperature, they're closely together, but then they have the option. In this case, they're producing a lot of heat. Here, they're producing little. In other words, they can regulate the amount of heat production at any one time by the spike frequency, by the number of active potentials to the muscle. So they can turn the heat production on and off in micro time, and just by sitting still. And the bees also, the bumblebees also incubate their brood, and it's started by a queen, and the eggs in here, and she sits on them like a hen sits on the brood, and when she does, she has a honey pot here to replenish the motor, produces the heat, and it turns out she uses the abdomen to transfer the heat there. And if you look at the energy expenditure in free flight, just like in the moths, it's independent of air temperature, but it's still regulated in flight. The huge scatter here is because it varies with the load that they carry. So the energy expenditure in flight is not related to the amount of heat needed to keep warm, it's related to the amount of work they need to keep the load aloft. But if you look at the incubation bee, the metabolic rate is just about as high as it is in flight when you get down to low temperatures. So these bees were incubating at 5 degrees C and having the same amount of energy expenditure, oxygen consumption, as in flight at any temperature. So these are bees that are sitting still, simply by activating the flight muscle and shivering. This is just data of temperature in flight. The thorax and abdomen, not very well regulated, but still quite a bit of regulation because the difference here is slight, the difference here is high. But abdominal temperature increases at higher air temperatures because they dump the heat into the abdomen, sort of like the moths. And if you look at the anatomy, again, it's similar to as in the moths. Here's tiny waist. This is where all the blood goes in and out. This is the thorax. This is just a tiny little waist. And here, again, we have a countercurrent area. And so it actually, by looking at the anatomy there, you would think that this countercurrent here is cold blood, warm blood, that they would not be able to dump heat into the abdomen. But they do, because the heat, the brood with the abdomen. Here, there's a nice smooth contact, and this is where the heat is. So there was a paradox here, and here is what actually happens, is diagrammatic, is that this is the thorax, here's the abdomen, and the blood can be pumped alternately through here so as to bypass the contact. So here's cold blood from the abdomen. Here's one instant in time. Here's the cold. Here's the hot. They're not together. In the next instant in time, this has passed through. It's here, and then the cold one passes. In other words, the countercurrent anatomy is bypassed by an alternating current cold and warm. So here, the anatomy is I've thought about, this might be a neat way to apply this to, let's say, ventilation in houses. Have air instead, where people in the winter want to retain all the heat in the house, but they want to get fresh air too. If they can shunt it through alternately, maybe it can be done so that you can retain the heat or have it going through the counter current. Let's say you can have it go through if they're going at the same time. If it's a steady stream going at the same time. And this is what happens with the bees too. So this happens only if they're really hot. Otherwise, it's streaming at both directions at the same time. Okay. Here's a cool bee. Actually, when the flowers have lots of, when the flowers are such that they can just visit many without having to fly from one to the other, then the body temperature goes down. They're saving energy because they don't have to fly. And so here you have a cool bee. And this then led to behavior of the bee. I was really interested because on some flowers the bees had a high temperature, and in other flowers they had a low temperature. So it related to different behaviors on different flowers. But it goes more than just physiology, also behavior. You look at some bees, and if this bee is doing the wrong thing, to forage from these flowers, it should land on this petal and crawl up here to get the honey. Instead, it landed on the top, didn't know what to do. So here's a bee that knew what it was doing. It landed here and crawled in and sucked the nectar, which is in here. So here's another bee that's collecting pollen from a rose, and you have to grasp groups of these anthers and vibrate them, shake it to get the pollen. Totally different behavior. So why were some bees doing one thing, some another? So I had to identify them, and so I put little tags on them, glued them on, and released them. Here's 32 red on master, and then followed them. So here is in the field, followed the bee around. This is a jewelweed, a very popular bumblebee flower. There were lots of bumblebees on it, but this particular individual was only going to the asterisk. Sometimes they would minor and visit a few of the others. So there were individual specializations, and that could be looked at in the lab too. By having bees here, you can reward with a little syringe from the bottom, let's say blue flowers, the white flowers are the blue flowers. You quickly train the bees to fly back and forth between the blue one or the white one, and so they learn, and they learn the mechanics of handling the flowers as well. And that got me then really interested in flowers, because basically the flowers are manipulating the bees into behavior. So here, for example, is the cornetum monkshood flowers, and here the nectar is actually really hidden. If the bee comes in here and pokes around, like most of them would, you wouldn't find any nectar. I have pulled away some of the petals here. This is where the nectar is. In these little sleeves, way up here, hidden up here under the moth's hood. And so why would a flower evolve like that? So you see puzzles like that. So this is a typical monkshood flower, but the explanation is that this only few, this keeps a high nectar supply. And this high nectar supply makes bees learn much quicker. If they get a lot of nectar, if they find one, boy, then they keep going back, and they will fly forever to find another one. In other words, if the flower is going to be widely distributed and not close together, to get the motivation to fly long distances, you've got to have a lot of reward. So they're manipulating it with a food reward. Okay, here I was going to talk about ravens. I don't know if I still should or not.
Yes.
Okay, so why did I get to ravens from bees? And the reason is, bees are colonial animals. They have communication, where one finds a nice flower in one particular hive, come back and communicate, and others go out and go there too. their family, and they share. Ravens, I knew, were very territorial birds, very aggressive birds. And I found a dozen or more at a moose carcass, and they were making a lot of noise, and I could hear them from at least a mile away. And before I knew anything about what was there, I said, there's got to be something there. And I went there, and sure enough, I found the ravens and the moose. I found the moose, the ravens had basically shown me. I know ravens were smarter than I was, so I knew they would know for sure that they heard that. So they would look at me like advertising. So this was a huge enigma. What was going on? Why were they sharing this moose carcass when they needed lots of meat, especially in the wintertime when they have really ravenous young. They really are ravenous, those ravens. So anyway, here's a raven, and you distinguish it from a crow by the throat feathers and one of the things, a much heavier beak. And here is the first photograph I ever got of a group of these ravens. Now these ravens in the New England woods are extremely shy. I mean, if you look at them, you know, like 100 yards away, boom, they are gone. And I wanted to find out, you know, what was going on, because sometimes they were peaceably feeding together, and it's very difficult to see them in the winter woods like this when they were foraging. And except, you know, you have to, I know they would, wolves would get right up to them. Well, the wolf picture is gone for some reason. I did have a wolf picture in here, somehow it didn't get in. But anyways, wolves, for some reason, they are wolf birds. They depend on wolves, on coyotes, on big animals to open carcasses to get the meat, because they can't even penetrate the skin of a squirrel, a raven. It's too tough for them. They have to have a big animal open it, so they're associated with carnivores. And that's why I call them the wolf birds. But anyways, what I had to do was build a little hut like this in the woods, and you actually have a string of wire going to a big enclosure where I had meat put in and gradually put it in after about a month till I had a bunch of them going in there, and I needed to get the individuals and tag them. And here I have, like with the bees, here's a red tag one, released. This is the log cabin in the woods there. And here's red, some number released. Here, there's another one white, another one is blue. But anyways, what I know, and I could distinguish old birds and young birds. And the young birds, the younger birds had red mouth linings. The older birds had black mouth linings. And the older birds had these dominance displays, and they were beating up on all the others, who had very submissive displays. So here we see again, they weren't always peaceful. Here's one attacking another. Whoops, shoot. Okay, this is a yell that they were making, and this, you see the light here, this is a younger bird. It could be a year or so old, maybe 2 years, but it doesn't have the black mouth lining. These were the ones that making the yell that I went to, and this rallies the birds to come together. They recruits them, and then it turns out the big crowds were coming from a communal roost, so they weren't all territorial. It turned out the younger birds band together. So with the postdoc, John Marsworth, we radio tagged a whole bunch of birds that we caught at one carcass, and the ones with the black mouth linings, they went to where the nest site was in the evening, and the others went to a roost with it. A whole bunch of them, 50 or more sometimes, would band together. And anyways, the point is that they arrive at the roost from different directions. This is the same roost. One day it's going one direction, another day So they go in different directions, as though there is some communication going within the roost, as you see in bees. We find out that the roosts do serve as information centers because when we took birds that we had in an aviary that we were made ignorant of where a carcass was, by having them out of the picture, they didn't know where any food was after a month. And then we put them in a pet cage and released it out of a tree by a roost. Then they would go the next day. These were radio tag birds, and they would go where the roost was feeding. So they got food simply by following others. If we released them into the woods and not at a roost, then they wouldn't find the food. Okay, so basically this is a model. Finds a carcass, the pair has a carcass, the juvenile comes by, these put on dominance display, he goes, or she goes, because it won't be allowed there, goes to the roost, and then we have this follow the next day. I'll skip some of this. Then also look at play behavior. Here, for example, is a raven flying over this dog, and the young ravens will always pester cats and dogs, and this is kind of a play, but what they're really doing is becoming acquainted with the behavior, and that's why they eventually get to be able to go close to wolves, because they basically become pets of the wolves, or vice versa. They get gradually used to each other, and that's how they get close, through this play behavior. And then look at intelligence. Here is a raven that has carved a piece of suet. All other birds, as far as I know, they will hack into it and take whatever they can, even little pieces. This raven is going to get a big piece. He's looking at the big chunks ahead. And this is a squirrel skin. Most undergraduate students have trouble skinning a squirrel, but the raven can do it even without an incision. So this is skinned right through the mouth, and this skin is turned inside out, the fur is on the inside. But you see, it didn't even penetrate the skin, but it got all the meat without damaging the skin. And then, looking at innate behavior, could they figure something out rather than just learning it? So some ravens could, without any previous experience, who had no experience with getting food on a string, pull things up by little loops and then stepping on it and until they got it. Others could go sideways and sidestep until they got to the end, they got the meat. So a second method. If that didn't work, then they could have it. Yeah, this one doesn't know how to do it, so it's waiting for this one to bring it up and then you steal it. So with that, I'll leave you with a raven angel. I hope we have still a little bit of time for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Heinrich has very kindly agreed to take a few questions. We have maybe 5 or perhaps 10 minutes for those, so we'll open the floor to whoever might have a question.
What's your view on experiments done in laboratory environments versus actually out in the wild?
I mean, it wouldn't have been possible to learn as much as we did without doing both. I mean, there's no way you could do the intelligence test, for example, in the wild, because you'd never know what his previous experiences of the bird. You'd say, well, he did it, but maybe he learned it somewhere. But I wanted to find out if he actually learned it. So the question depends on the question. You know, if they have roosts, then we have to go out in the field. Actually, we tried to see if we could duplicate some of the roost behavior in the big aviary, and we couldn't. It's too small. So some behavior you can only see in the field, and some in the details. You know, let's see how one jabs another, what they does, and who jabs who. you know, you have to have it close. Yes?
I used to live in Vermont, was familiar with ravens there, and now I live in the Atlanta area and have flocks of ravens that come to my yard.
Ravens?
I'm pretty sure they are. They walk along, they're a lot bigger than the crows, they've got the big beak.
Wow.
Am I making a mistake? Is there a
I don't know.
chance?
I don't know. I just hadn't heard that they were in here, but I don't know. Yeah.
I'll take some pictures of them.
Yeah.
and send them to you.
Yeah.
But my question was, are there different varieties of ravens in different areas of the country, or are they all pretty much the same?
Well, the western ravens, western United States, for example, are thought to be a subspecies. I don't know. They sound a little different, but wherever I've been, ravens, I can almost identify where they're from by their dialects. So, you know, the ones I've seen in Europe, they sounded different. But then the individual differences as well. But definitely, I knew if I'm in a different area, they sound a little different. Yeah. But they say the Alaska ravens are bigger, but when I looked at the data of some of the main ones, they were pretty big too. There's quite a bit of variation, so it's very hard to make any generalizations. I mean, they are very widely distributed. They fly. You know, the ones that we've marked in Maine, they ended up some in Quebec and some in New York and Boston area, all over the place. So they wander really widely. So, you know, it's not that they're local populations evolving around because they're spread all over the place.
Wait a minute, yeah.
When you grabbed and stabbed the moths to take the readings, did you only do it one time per individual moth?
Yes.
Does it kill them?
Yes. Yes?
When you we read your book in our LCC class for A Year in the Maine Woods, and I know you would bring carcasses to the ravens. Did you notice a difference in behavior when you would bring a carcass versus ones that you might have stumbled upon, like in their feeding behavior?
Yeah, I was very surprised that they were very, very hesitant to go to calf carcasses. And in fact, just last few weeks, I brought up the calf carcass, and it was, they never went. I saw a pair fly by it, see it, make a motion that they saw it, but they never came back. So, and the same thing happened last year. So, but I do know, if there's a dead deer or a dead moose, it almost immediately gets visited by ravens. So, it took quite a while before they were used to going to calf carcasses. And I should mention one reason why I call them wolf birds is in Yellowstone. I was looking at gut piles just outside the park in Gardner, where there had been hunters, big gut piles. Ravens would fly over and pay no attention to them. In the park, the wolves kill an elk, and the ravens are hovering right there. As soon as the elk is down, the ravens are right there around, and so they cue in on the carnivores. And so I think in Maine, as soon as they find out that there's a person that has been near the carcass, then they're going to stay away if they possibly can. So always try to, well, usually if that happened, there usually wouldn't be a raven around, but that's sort of my impression, that as soon as you go near the carcass, then they're not going to go in. Same as the coyotes. And if the coyotes don't even go there, then they won't go there either.
The reference to one of Dr. Heinrich's books reminds me there are some books for sale, which he's very happy to autograph, I believe. But before we get to Dr. Heinrich's books, there's a publication I think we have for him, and from some students.
You know, it's not quite as good as your book, or books, because we've read several of them. But I'm a third-year honors program student. I had the privilege and honor of taking one of Hugh Crawford's classes last semester. And it was actually an environmental class. So we're the ones that built your log cabin, not yours, but the playhouse version of it. So afterwards, we would love to walk and show it to you and explain to it. But the other half of our project is basically to create along with it.
Oh, wow.
It is loosely based on some of your works,
Wow.
including why we ran and the year in many ways. So we'd like to present this.
Wow. That's very honored. Wow. What is the log cabin? And wow, look at this. Even my training log here. Wow.
There's a lot.
It's hours of fun, I can
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, this is gonna be fun. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a bee too.
If everyone else who wants to take a look at our magazine, we do have several copies floating around. We just ask that you please return them at the end, so you can attach them to our log cabin. That's yours.
Well, is there anything I can do in return? I'll show you some pictures of the cabin or something.
We would love to.
Yeah, really? Yeah, I'll email you. Okay, email me and I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
And thank all of you. Let me invite everybody to come and see the books. Go see the cabin now. You can see the magazine. But before we do that, let's all thank Bernd Heinrich for a quick